Hello and welcome to the Novel Cohorts Podcast. I'm here with Skip Olson from Olson Strategies, and we have an exciting episode today to talk about implementation science. So, wanted to give Skip a chance to introduce himself. We met up in Athens at the Market Access Forum meeting, and he has some great and interesting work he's done his whole career relating to how do we bring um, medical discoveries into the actual patient and how to get things all the way through the complex medical system. So, Skip, why don't you tell me a bit about your background and how you got involved in the work you've been doing?
Uh, s- so good morning, good afternoon, Dan. Pleasure to be here. My route is a little bit unusual. I got a PhD in biostatistics, went straight into the pharmaceutical industry, and I designed and analyzed clinical trials for a number of years. I switched to health economics and outcomes research, did that for a number of years. That kind of morphed into real world evidence, which morphed into integrated evidence. And as part of that, I got hooked on to the topic of today's podcast, implementation science. And so this is what I've been focusing on over the last few years, doing a few publications to sort of bring this concept into the pharma industry.
I think a lot of people may be working in implementation science and don't even know it. And a lot of people also haven't heard of it, although I've recently come across a number of groups that call themselves implementation science teams inside of pharma. But for the folks who are listening, maybe you can give an introduction to what is implementation science. And I think there's a couple slides we have to help educate. So let me see if I can bring those up.
Yeah, it goes by several different names. So it's not just implementation science. One of the names in the US is also, so related to uh, clinical care gaps. And so it goes by a lot of different acronyms and names. They're related, maybe they're not quite the same, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But this as a concept in the pharma industry is so important because of, what anyone watching a video sees as a slide. I'll explain the slide now. It's just two curves, so it's pretty easy to think about. The one curve has a very slow uptake. So this you can think about it as either sales or the number of patients who are actually getting prescribed onto a new medication. And the uptake is quite slow for the first 5 or 6 years. Then the uptake picks up a little bit, and then you hit peak sales, and it stays at peak sales for a number of years, and then loss of exclusivity, and it drops off. So what I actually have on the slide here, in this slow sort of average uptake, is actually based on a real medication, Entresto, for heart failure. They had very, very, very slow sales at the beginning. It did eventually pick up, but very slowly. The question is, or the challenge really is, before the product actually launched, Forbes predicted what the eventual sales would be. And that graph, if you can see the graph, is the blue curve, looks much different. The uptake is much quicker. The height of the peak is much higher. And what I call the sort of the implementation gap is the difference between these two curves. And here in this particular example, and in several that I've done, the gap is like threefold. You could get up to threefold the kinds of sales if you were able to actually get a very fast uptake to a much higher peak than you would normally be getting. And this gap, often people think, oh, well, the outcomes weren't, good enough, or they weren't convincing enough. And this is kind of a myth. A lot of times I start off my talks by saying, have you ever had wonderful phase 3 results and thinking this product will sell itself, and then you discover, well, actually it doesn't sell itself. There's something else missing, So with Entresto, they had 20% reduction in mortality and hospitalization. Everyone thought this will revolutionize the care of heart failure. Every patient will go on to Entresto, and they didn't. Okay, uptake was extremely slow, and a lot of the reasons why this uptake was slow are implementation issues or implementation barriers. It's not the product itself. The results were great. The issues were in different areas. For example, cardiologists on a whole, an average, thought that the medications that had been on the market for a long time were effective and they were good enough. They didn't need a new medication. Okay, well, this is a behavioral change. They saw the results of Entresto. They saw the 20% reduction. That wasn't enough to change their behavior to say, oh, wonderful drug, I'm going to start prescribing tomorrow. And the question is, well, this kind of behavioral change, this is an implementation barrier. How do you implement a new product into the marketplace? How do you ensure that the mindset is right for the prescribers, that they actually prescribe? How do you ensure that the patients, don't have any reservations and that they actually want the product? How do you ensure that the payers have what they want? And a lot of times, what we do in the pharma industry is we just flood the market with more information, more evidence. But a lot of times it's more of the same, so more efficacy results. Well, the 20% is already pretty convincing, or should be. Another study showing 20%, is that really what they want? Is that what they need? So the question is, okay, the old products, oh, they're okay. We don't need anything new. And, the way of doing Entresto, it doesn't really fit into the way I do my practice. If I have a stable patient, can I actually switch them onto a new medication? I mean, they're stable now. Do I interrupt that? So there are these lingering questions, not about the product or not about its efficacy and safety, but more about how to give it. Should I give it? How do I give it? When do I give it? When a patient has had an event, heart failure, and they're in the hospital, is that a good time to switch the patient? So these questions, all of them were known way before launch. They could have been acted upon, but of course they weren't. Because the way things work in pharma, to simplify it, is you focus on getting registration, and you really focus just on that. Then you focus on getting reimbursement and figuring, if I have registration and I have reimbursement, everything else will fall in place and it will be sold. It will be prescribed. Not thinking that there are these other things, there are these other questions, more human, more behaviorally oriented, that cause issues. They cause these barriers. And a lot of times this is what these implementation barriers are. How do I implement the product into the whole work stream within a healthcare system? And a lot of this is currently being neglected. It doesn't fall under anyone's responsibility. And therefore, we come up with this huge gap between what a product actually realizes, what it actually sells, and what it could sell. So this is this nice sort of implementation gap. If you go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more. This issue can also be thought of as we know a lot of stuff. This is the evidence from our phase 3 trials. That's what we know. That's our evidence. What we do in clinical practice, that's something different. Okay, in Entresto's case, we knew that Entresto gives you the 20% reduction, but what they were doing in practice for a few years after the launch is they were ignoring what's known in the scientific literature. And they were continuing to prescribe what they have always prescribed. And this process takes a very long time to go from what we know to what we do. And only a little bit of the research that's done actually ends up in clinical practice. So there's a science behind how to speed things up and how to get things into clinical practice better and quicker. And this is what implementation science is all about. And it really is a scientific study with methods that promote the systematic uptake of research findings into routine practice. And it's based a lot on more behavioral methods. And so this is why pharma thinks, oh, I don't want to touch that. That's, out of our clear-cut realm of, phase 3 randomized trial, easy to set up, easy to interpret, everyone's happy. This is a little bit different, okay? But it's there for solving a different issue. It's there for solving this implementation gap, for addressing the implementation barriers. So it's a different tool, it's a different tactic, but it's something that shouldn't be ignored, because if you do ignore it, you end up with this implementation gap, which could end up with a lot of money being left on the table. So we're talking billions left on the table of sort of a missed opportunity of what a pharma company could have earned if they had actually addressed some of these implementation barriers.
And so, what do you think the big opportunity is for implementation science now? Now we're in 2025. As you know, investors are looking at what's your AI strategy. I haven't heard a lot about investors saying what's your implementation science strategy. What should teams be thinking about? What's the opportunity? Where do you see things going right now?
It sort of start small, okay, but start, okay. And by starting small, my recommendation is always, well, okay, do you even know what the implementation barriers are? And if you know what they are, do you know what the root cause is that's setting up the barrier in the first place? And so, my recommendation is, okay, put in place something that's systematic and scientific early in the sort of drug development process, back sort of phase 2 at the latest, to really look into what are the implementation barriers, can we address them, and what's really causing them, to know, can we address them? Because addressing them early, i.e. before or just after launch, is really going to change the shape of that uptake of your whole sales curve. And so this is the most critical point, is to really address what are the barriers, what are the root causes, can we do anything about them? And if so, yeah, it's pretty easy to look at what the impact is going to be, and therefore the business case becomes very clear. And so the rationale to do it is very clear, but you have to know what is it we're up against, and where could we potentially be leaving money on the table. So my assessment is, what's the biggest opportunity? Well, identify what the barriers are in a systematic way, product by product, disease area by disease area, and that's a wonderful starting point.
Can you think of things that would actually help? I guess I'm trying to figure out what's the practical result of the implementation science, or examples that you may have thought of places where you would insert either evidence or tools. What does it look like? And even if we haven't done it successfully yet, because I think that's something we can talk about, because we try and work in some stuff. What do you think it could look like?
So, I mean, identifying what the barriers are, this can be done in one of a number of different ways. One of the ways that it's in one of my papers, I've proposed is, health economics normally does an early value dossier where they look at different impacts and different values and different opportunity costs. It would be relatively easy to insert into something like an early value dossier, sort of an assessment on the implementation barriers in this particular area. It uses, for that kind of contextual analysis, is what it's referred to identify what are the barriers and what are the root causes, relies a little bit on methods that aren't unfamiliar to health economics, but maybe not practiced all the time. So sometimes it's surveys, sometimes it's Delphi panels, sometimes it's doing a biomarker research study. All of these put together, or literature review. I mean, all of these put together, all of these put together really give us what we're looking for. Are there barriers? Are they important barriers that are really going to hold us back from getting the kind of uptake that we're looking for? So that's what we really need to be doing, early on to identify what the problems are.
So once you have the problems, how do you solve them? Because I think when we're doing normal real world evidence, we're doing evidence on patients, right? When we're trying to do implementation science, it seems like you're both generating evidence on health system behavior, patient and physician behavior, and maybe there's economic barriers, other things that are complex. How do you go about fixing them and making investments above and beyond just pointing a finger at a potential problem?
Yeah. So it depends, obviously. It depends on what the issue is. It depends on the disease area. It could range anywhere from, sort of adding things, and of course, clinical development hates to hear this, but adding things to a phase 3 trial to look at more in detail things around patient experience. So that has to be expanded to really look into different kinds of endpoints. So not the clinical endpoints, but really the implementation endpoints. Is this something the patient likes? Is this something that they find easy to deal with? Is this something they're going to continue with? As well, asking the staff of the clinical trial itself, the site staff, asking them detailed questions about their experience, and with lens to, is the process smooth? Are there things that need to be improved, changed, to eventually, further down the line, help smooth out these bumps, these barriers. Okay, so doing things like this and asking the sites what their experience is, these are kinds of things that aren't currently done. They're easy enough to do. Everyone worries about the patient burden in a clinical trial. People also worry about, the site personnel burden. But with a little bit of discussion about how this information will be used in the future, I'm sure that this kind of an issue can be overcome. So it's sort of one approach. Another approach is to do kind of a study. We talk about hybrid 1, 2, and 3 studies, mixed method approaches. With the hybrid studies, they either focus on clinical outcomes and have implementation outcomes as secondary, or flip it around and you have implementation outcomes as primary, and you do also measure, maybe not with the intention of testing for the clinical outcomes. So there are different ways of collecting information on an implementation strategy, and the implementation strategy is what will be needed to ensure that the drug is taken up into the healthcare system. Now, this might mean that the patient flow through an actual site needs to be modified. And with this modified approach to a pathway through the site, how a patient is dealt with, that can be tested. Current approach, new approach. So this implementation strategy can be tested, and you find out, okay, does this gain us anything? Is it helping to implement things quicker? It could entail, specific forms of education. It can entail a lot of different things as specific strategies to overcome these barriers, and they can be put out in a different number of ways, either through studies or through simple things like a Delphi panel or a survey. It doesn't always have to be a classical study.
So as you know, here at Graticule, we do everything EHR. What can we do within the medical record? Some of that's real world data. Some of that's how can we adjust the decision support functions of the EHR. How do you see the EHR fitting into implementation science?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a similar question that I asked to someone a few years ago who has a system on social media listening, putting it into a structured, panel kind of from social media listening. This is mostly from a patient point of view. But I said, I'm not interested in the, the more common things about, sort of efficacy and safety. I really want to know about, sustainability. I want to know about acceptability, more things that are going to ensure that the uptake is there, that the product is actually implemented. So when it comes to an EHR system, this is normally, the physician writing things about the patient. It would be great to have some fields. I say fields, but it could be, sort of information extracted from notes, but it would be a different kind of note. What about the physician's opinion themselves, and not necessarily about the patient and how the patient is doing, but like, oh my God, I can't stand, dealing with patients on this medication because they always have this problem, and this problem. Or there's too much paperwork to fill out with the patients on this medication. I can't stand the extra effort and burden. Or this requires an infusion and I'm just not set up for it. It's causing problems. I can only do one patient. So it's these kinds of insights that would add tremendously to these sort of implementation issues, the implementation barriers, our knowledge of them and our knowledge of the root cause behind them. So I'll flip the question back to you, Dan, to sort of ask you, well, okay, you know the EHR systems a whole lot better than I do. where could this information either be A, put in, or B, extracted from existing?
Well, as you frame it, it's tricky because you're asking a physician to enter in a medical record, which is very patient-centered. It'd be like using a CRM system for your sales team and asking them to suddenly enter, what makes it hard to sell. They're only going to enter, this particular person I contacted last week. So there isn't a field to put it in. I think there's probably opportunities within the EHR to put in notes. I mean, I have seen, and I think this is an interesting part that I've looked at AMIA, which is the American Medical Informatics Association, where they review different um, research people have done, and they do research into clinical decision support specifically because clinical decision support, which is those pesky alerts from the doctor's perspective often, where they're being flashed with 100 little warning lights on a patient, and the immediate reaction is, this is about as useful as the warning lights on my car. If it says my TPS sensor is off, but my tires seem full, I'm going to ignore that for the rest of my life. I bring that up because they do have within the clinical decision support world systems that they built to provide feedback on those alerts, to say this alert isn't useful, this kind of information isn't useful, or this information was useful, to be able to track not just what people's response are, but what's the quality of the information being delivered to the physician. Because I think increasingly electronic health records, especially with tools like AI, especially with tools like application programming interfaces, to interact with the physician to guide them a little bit more on the patient to the current evidence base, which is ever changing. All those systems need to be controlled. So I think an opportunity area to work in is the clinical decision support realm, which is not a uniform thing. One thinks of clinical decision support as just an alert, but clinical decision support are things like order sets, ways to support a referral. There are lists you generate on patients who have a care gap, back to the question of care gaps, and in those supporting tools, you might be able to get some of that feedback when you're asking the physicians to provide feedback on the tool. So that's one thought. I'd also say, um, while we might not get the direct answer from the data in the EMR, we certainly can test a lot of hypotheses about what's really going on. We can say, how often does a referral occur here? How often does a patient end up in an infusion center when they should versus not? And we can see, if we were to build a patient journey map or something that looks like what our hypothesized journey of how someone gets access to medication should work, the real journeys don't look like that. And we can go into, once we have the evidence from the real journeys being different from the idealized journeys, then we can go back to the clinicians and start asking those questions with data in hand.
Yeah.
Right. To say, why is this happening? Why is it that all these patients aren't being referred from the dermatology practice to the allergist, and the allergist has the tools to prescribe a monoclonal antibody, whatever the problem is.
Yeah.
Right. That's where I think we can use the EMR. But I want to be open-minded, because there's probably ways to implement just general feedback systems as well, if we think it through. Like, there's ways to communicate to doctors, because they have surveys we could put out. You can get things through the medical record to classes of physicians, to build in feedback loops. So I guess a couple other questions, maybe taking it another direction, is, how do you think groups can cost justify these investments into implementation science? Because I know that there's a big tightening of the belt in pharma due to macroeconomic issues. Do you think it's going to be a big headwind for moving the science forward, or is it the opposite? Well, you got to make more money off of each drug if you're going to have pressure in terms of price.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy and it's not. It should be easy, but oftentimes it's not. And the way it goes is, okay, think of these two curves that we either showed or described at the beginning. You have this kind of standard looking uptake curve, which, kind of slow at the beginning, then you hit a peak, and then it drops off. It's easy enough, although people don't do it, to think about, okay, if I do a particular action, particular activity, specifically designed to change some of the inflection points on such a curve, then what could I change that curve to? Okay. Now I have an activity, has a cost, and I have an impact of that activity, a new sales curve. Okay. Now I can easily calculate a return on investment, or like, the whole development organization does, I could calculate an expected net present value, so ENPV. And I can show that, this however many $1 million investment is going to add, whatever, 10% onto the total. But, we're only talking about blockbuster drugs because that's all Pharma looks at now, and then 10% of something that's earning 1 billion in each year at peak. 10% of that is a lot of money. And it clearly outweighs the few millions that you're going to be putting in to place to overcome some of these barriers. So the economic argument is easy. But I use the comparison to health economics. In health economics, we have, sort of cost effectiveness and the budget impact. So the cost effectiveness is there, making the investment will give the return, fine. But there's the budget impact, okay? The budget across a pharma portfolio is, of course, limited and has an upper boundary year after year, which means that you have to make a very good business case in the manner that I just explained to put forward to say, okay, investing the money here is going to be better than investing the money somewhere else where you have a lower return on investment. Therefore, we should be getting the money. And that is how you should be overcoming the budget impact, part of it. But teams normally aren't sophisticated enough to actually do the sort of the business case in a convincing enough way. Plus, there's no one to really champion this. Is it going to be health economics? Is it going to be the marketing team? Is it going to be medical affairs? There's no one really driving implementation barriers forward as a part of their kind of list of activities, responsibilities to say, I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to drive this forward because this is important for patients and for our bottom line. So these two combined, are kind of holding things back. But it can be done relatively easily. I think this is what the industry has to come to grips with, and it has to do a better job with.
Great. Because AI is such a big factor, the big change agent in today's world, everyone's used some ChatGPT here and there. Do you see that helping the implementation science world in some way, or in some particular way that moves the thought process or the tools available forward?
I mean, I see AI being used everywhere across the pharma industry. And certainly just for the easiest thing, if you go into any disease area and ask the likes of ChatGPT, what are the implementation barriers in this particular disease area? You have to be specific about not just saying, heart failure, for example, but you have to specify what type of heart failure, blah, blah, blah. And it might depend on the country. So you might have to say in the US healthcare system, whatever. and it will give you answers. Okay, and so from a starting point of view, use it to get insights, but combine those with insights that you already have, because the medical team anyway is going to be talking with KOLs in the field, etc. As well as whatever kinds of surveys or whatever that you decide to implement that with. So that's the easy kind of thing that anyone can do immediately. The question is, how can AI really be used to enhance, to simplify, to bring implementation scientists a little bit further along within the pharma setting? And I'll leave that, sort of as an open thought. I'm, in the middle of looking into ways applying AI there. I'm certainly open to any kind of suggestions, so if you have any, wonderful to hear them. Otherwise, people can get in touch with me and say, oh, I think AI would be useful here, here, and here, and I'd be happy to hear them.
Well, it certainly comes to the next question, which I think everyone talks about when we try and propose solutions to an implementation gap, which is the scale question. So we find a gap, we can go work with XYZ health system, we can prove that it's possible to overcome this gap. But that's one health system.
Yeah.
And unlike when you generate evidence about biology, give this drug, patient's hair changes color, it doesn't matter what it is, it's pretty definitive. Each health system is its own independent operating framework, and transplanting operating rules at a health system is really hard.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious what you think about other ways to scale implementation science or scale the results of it, to get to real change, because it is different than, I think, just presenting evidence in a paper or presentation.
Yeah, most cases, you're absolutely right. So I like to think of it in three different ways. The one is, you said biology. I refer to it as sort of a universal implementation barrier, one that resonates across healthcare systems, whether there's different healthcare systems in the US or different geographies like, Germany, France, UK, China, whatever. Sometimes there will be universal barriers that are common to many healthcare systems. Okay, and these might be the ones that you decide to prioritize to actually address, because they're automatically at scale. Okay, and so if those exist, those are really the ones that you want to prioritize. The next level down is sort of, in the US, or within any country, it doesn't matter. To help with scaling up, it's often extremely important to partner. Even if you find a sort of a universal implementation barrier, you're going to want to partner anyway. But if there isn't one, and you have to go to a couple individual healthcare systems, you're going to want to partner with a patient association, with a medical association, with any kind of association that has some kind of authoritative voice that could help with the message of, these are the problems, not really specific, but these are the problems we're seeing in these healthcare systems. These solutions have worked. We think that these or similar solutions will work. These are the kinds of things that you should be bringing to your healthcare systems, and this will lead to better care. So this kind of indirect but very influential kinds of ways of spreading the message we see as extremely helpful. So that's one way. The other way is to get involved with kind of modeling project to say, okay, what are the important parameters in this healthcare system versus another one? What have they done here? What have they done there? What could other healthcare systems do? Would they do if they did the same thing as healthcare system A? Would they also see the kind of benefit that healthcare system A did? So this kind of thought about modeling this out and predicting what a different healthcare system might achieve. This is something that hasn't been tapped into at all, and could be.
Well, certainly in a world where data is more liquid, or analytics is more liquid, or the cheaper and easier we can do those modeling activities, the more we could maybe get those pieces to not be so complex. Because I think that's one of the issues is
Exactly.
There aren't a lot of spare dollars inside of a health system to say, let's go model. I'll use Entresto. Let's go model Entresto's adoption. They'll say, well, that's not my problem,
Yeah,
right? We have other things to do. But I like your idea that, and we've always tried to work through this, but it is complex because there comes a multi-ball pool shot, to figure out how to work with both the medical associations and the patient advocacy organizations, because they do have the convening capacity as well as the distribution capacity to put things in that'll avoid a whole lot of concerns about business and ethics and other stuff about how you're going to interact on behalf of the patient and the clinicians. So I think that's a big important piece. Maybe the last question, and because I know we have to get going, and I hope everyone who's listened, I've always find it fascinating to hear about new things. And Skip, you have such a great background in it. Is where should people go to learn what others are doing in implementation science? What do you think is needed that maybe doesn't even exist for implementation science? Because it's I can go to an RWE conference, I can go to a medical affairs conference. I wouldn't really necessarily know, other than to bump into you and some other disciples in various different places, where to go.
Yeah. So, I mean, not to, push more business to me or whatever, but, a simple way of seeing how important implementation science is in pharma, how it can have an impact, also to give an idea about the sort of the business case. I have a couple of, short, editorials that have been published. So, just sort of Google my name with implementation science, and you'll come up with a couple of very easy to read introductory things. Just to learn a little bit more about implementation science and pharma. To find out what other people are doing, there is on LinkedIn a consortium on implementation science that is open. You might have to request to join, but certainly you'll be granted access if you do request that. So it's called Consortium on Implementation Science. They do offer some webinars. So one is coming up on November 4th with a professor who I've worked with a lot from Duke. Then there are things like I'm working with the Swiss Implementation Science Network. We have a conference coming up in February in Zurich, where one of the topics will be at a pre-conference workshop to say, okay, what is it that people, especially in the industry, need in terms of, do we need a compendium of case studies that people can refer to? Where could this be put? How could it be put together? So these kinds of solutions we're just thinking about, we're just, about ready to act to put these things together. But certainly the consortium, or just, read a couple of my quick articles, that's a great way of starting.
Great. Well, I think it's been wonderful to hear from you, Skip, and I really do love this space because I've always been a fan of better living through data, and I think that kind of is secondary to better living through chemistry if we're thinking of the pharma industry. And so implementation science can get us there past when these phase 3 studies and all these other studies come out to really both benefit the sponsors as well as benefit the patients to get things in the hands of doctors faster and get things in patients faster. So I think you're doing great work.
I mean, it's not going to be the magic silver bullet which solves all problems, okay? But the incremental value is significant. It's another approach. It's another tool. It's another way for reaching more patients faster, and making things easier for a product actually to get into a patient's hands. And that should be our goal in what we do with the pharmaceutical science, is to ensure that patients actually receive the product. Only then can they benefit from it. And this, approach of implementation science is one way of notching up our effort to make sure that that actually happens.
Okay, any last words, or should
I think I just made it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Skip. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. And for everyone who's listening, thanks for your time. And
Great.
hope we'll see each other around.
Perfect. Thanks for having me. And yeah, we'll be in touch, like you said.